Good evening, thank you all for coming. I'm told, and Chris is on the front line to make sure that I do this, the fire exit, if there's an exit, is through into the yard at the back, so the fire doors are behind you. The toilets, if you need them, are out this door, across the alleyway, and down the passage opposite. And the last thing is to ask you to turn your mobile phones off, or your land phones if you've got them with you, I suppose. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Gerry Hassan, and I'm the host for the day. My name is Richard Macfarlane. That's the main role, is try to keep some order here, and particularly over Gerry as we race off. So Gerry is Professor of Social Change at Glasgow Caledonian University, so he knows quite a lot of useful information about the process of social change, which independence or non-independence is a part of. Today we're talking about his book, edited with Simon Barrow, called A Better Nation, which says something about his perspective. And it's described by broadcaster Leslie Riddoch as ambitious thinking about Scotland's future, combined with reasonable challenges to the present case for independence. And I thought that was quite a good description of the book, which I have read from cover to cover. So the plan in the next hour or so is, first of all, to ask Gerry about the current context for independence, some of the key issues highlighted in the book, and Gerry will say a bit more about the structure of the book, I hope, when we start off. Then to ask Gerry about their approach as editors, Gerry and Simon, how they approach this, and it's building on his role as Professor of Social Change, so that sort of knowledge. And that really addresses the front and back ends of the book, so this is a sandwich structure. And then finally we're going to open the floor to you people, and we'll take questions, and there's a roving mic which will help with that. So the first thing I was planning to ask Gerry was just what was your intentions in editing this book when you set out on it?
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Chris, for inviting me here to Gatehouse of Fleet. Just to say, I am a local author now in Dumfries and Galway because myself and my partner Rosie moved to Kirkcudbright from Glasgow last August, and I'm just loving it basically. We'd agreed many years ago that we were going to move from Glasgow. It wasn't a retiral move. And then there was the issue of putting it off to the ideal point, basically. Why Simon and I did this book was to get into some of the detail on independence, to get into some of the issues of the trade-offs, the values, the choices, and explorations of that in a Scottish context, but also a UK context and internationally. And we came at that in a commissioning way. I mean, this is the fourth book Simon and I have done, and as it's always the case, when you start thinking how to put the subject matter together, you end up doing books that are bigger and bigger. And the geopolitical, the international part of the book could have ended up as a book itself, because once you go into that, you're into foreign policy, you're into the UK's role internationally, you're into Brexit. There's just a whole host of detail there. But we wanted to do a book that was not necessarily, it's not as a collection for independence, and it's definitely not against it, but it's a serious exploration for people that are looking for more detail. So in our commissioning, I would say maybe half the people in that book roughly are pro-independence of the 30 contributors. There's a good selection of people who are opposed to independence and even worked on the No campaign in 2014. And there's a host of people, a large group of people who have not declared, various academics or so on. And you could probably work out various people's, biases, etc. But if you take somebody even he's a very obvious choice, but John Curtis at Strathclyde University, I personally know which way John voted by adding the numbers together, but John's never, anywhere, ever in the world declared whether he's for independence or against it. He's interested in the electoral landscape of this debate, like and you know, as an election contest, and the numbers, and provides, you know, world-class analysis on that. So that was the aim initially, to offer a serious contribution to the debate for people of all persuasions.
Great. Can you just say a bit more about the structure of the book? You referred to the 30 contributors. So how is that structured?
Well, it's really, there's really, I think there's 7 sections in the book, but it falls into just a couple of basically, you know, overarching themes. There's an exploration of the electoral landscape, and this might come as good news to some people and bad news to some people, but we already are in the beginning, well, we already are in the next independence referendum campaign, unofficially, obviously. And so in that section, we've got people from the Yes campaign exploring what the future Yes campaign will be like, and people from the No campaign looking at what the next No campaign, assuming they are yes and no in the questions. And then we've got John Curtis looking at numbers. We've got people looking at, you know, the floating voters, the undecided, because there's actually a lot of churn goes on underneath the numbers. You know, I even use this sometimes as shorthand, talking about a 50-50 nation, but we're not actually like that underneath it. There's 2 groups of voters very set in their ways, and there's a whole host of movement in between, and then people going into don't knows and coming out, people voting for the first time in 2014 in huge numbers that hadn't voted in a generation. And so from that setting out, we look at the language of the debate and what's underneath that language on all perspectives, the values that Scotland wants to embody in public policy, which is a bit of a big subject, and how we advance that, how we're serious about that, where we fall short, obviously. And then there's a whole section on, 2 sections on Scotland and its international choices. And again, all of that reflects things like there's the relationship with England, there's the nature of the British government, there's what's happened with Brexit, there's Britain's role, influence worldwide, etc. And as the United Kingdom is changing, clearly, you know, that has consequences for England, Wales, Northern Ireland, also the Republic. So we explore these issues as well. There's big issues for British/English conservatism and the British/English Labour Party. And these are subjects that people, you know, in Westminster, it may not come into our politics on the TV a lot, but they think about these things a lot. How the Scottish debate shifts England/Britain, you know, and I think this is something that may emerge even more when, you know, the Tory leadership contest is decided.
Okay, I thought perhaps one of the first things we should do is address the 3 big issues which seem to come out from the last 2014 election, which is now quite a long time ago. One being about borders, particularly the border with England, one being about currency, and the third one being about relationship with Europe. So perhaps I thought that there was relatively degree of reassurance about dealing with the first two of those, the currency and the by the contributors in the book. I don't know whether you've got something you can summarise on.
I would even pitch it, you know, at another level before coming on to specifics. The way this debate is framed is that, and we've got lots and lots of data on 2014 why people voted the way they did. And one of the big issues we have is that independence until 2011 was not a mainstream subject of discourse in Scotland politically, apart from obviously in the SNP, and to a lesser extent the Greens. And the independence referendum, that long campaign, normalised the issue of independence. It became part of our mainstream. And that is a huge strategic success by the Yes movement, and it isn't going away. Now, within that, because you found that, again, loads of data, soft no voters really liked the idea of independence. Why wouldn't you? It's just a nice idea of a subject in the world. They liked really attracted to it. And then they didn't like some of the specifics. They didn't like the S&P economic offer. They thought it was there was issue of currency and borders, and they didn't like Alex Salmond. Well, obviously, they were particularly right on one of those, you know. But what it shows is that the argument as it is at the moment, and this is something no campaigners are very aware of, the argument in defence of the union is a transactional argument. It's an argument that's based on independence having to address every possible variable. Now, clearly, the currency and the borders are particularly big issues, and then there's the Barnett formula and so on. But it is a last-ditch defence, I think, of the union. The union has to make the case for itself, like independence does. Otherwise, if you continually fight a defensive argument, eventually you lose. And so one of those big arguments, actually, I mean, as well as currency and borders, is the issue about Barnett. Now, Barnett means at the moment, and some independence people don't like this, there's a fiscal transfer, there's an inarguable fiscal transfer happens from UK to Scotland, as it happens to Wales, as it happens to Northern Ireland, and there's actually fiscal transfers to all of England, apart from London and the South East, because the UK is so unequal. But if you base your defence of that union on Barnett, big if, well, maybe not that big enough, if British politics Toryism goes more and more rightwards, eventually Barnett will be abolished or very, very much diluted. It's all been changed once in the early 90s. So you have to think about, it's not just that independence has to answer specifics, which it does. The union has to come up with a better version of itself. Because one of the drivers of this debate, it's something people in London, even London media, you know, that are very seasoned, don't get. This is not just a debate about Scotland. This is a debate about how the United Kingdom is governed and misgoverned. And misgoverned for most people in the United Kingdom. You know, most people in England don't get a very good deal out of this, you know, increasingly, I would just use this word, bastardised version of British politics. You know, a system that used to work for working people, but increasingly doesn't. And so the Scottish debate is partly a manifestation of that. We have, or think we have, a way of, you know, saying, no thanks, we can try something better now. That's a whole other debate again about whether it will be, but that's a premise a lot of people start from, particularly people who are not Scottish nationalists in this debate, who are for independence.
Okay, I rather thought in the book that the issues of currency and borders, the answer to those have emerged more profoundly, particularly through the COVID era with currency changing, or the use of money changing quite dramatically.
Yeah.
But also with the discussions around the Northern Ireland border and the border with Europe. Those things have clarified the way forward in a way, even though perhaps we're not all there yet.
Yeah. I would just say that I think, I personally think the union's got a lot of work to do on, you know, saving the union if it wants to save itself. But independence, it's both of these offers in a way, and indeed shades of grey in between. They have work to do. It's not an accident, even though we're not quite that 50-50 nation, as I said earlier. You know, it's not an accident that neither side has established a great big lead since 2014. That is not an accident. This is a case unproven in a sense. And what you know, pro-union forces would say, they would take some succour from that. You know, look at Brexit, look at British politics, and it's still, you know, in play. Whereas independence would also say, and I think this is profoundly true, A, independence has become mainstream, and secondly, we are at, in terms of long-term trend, I mean, there's been a couple of polls with independence higher, long-term trend, independence has banked the gains it made in the independence referendum, and is at a historic all-time high. And that is not going away anytime soon. And from the people I know who were very, very thoughtful no campaigners, and, you know, these people, you know, worked for Better Together, we all know that unless the UK does some miraculous, conversion on its deathbed, in a sense, you know, is that we will have a second independence referendum. And so that's then about how we have this, how we make it a better experience than the last time, which for lots of us it was a good experience, but there's still things to learn, you know, and lots of imperfections. And that will be much more competitive and much more open to, like, you know, the forces of independence winning it than were last time.
The last week or so, maybe the week before, the Scottish Government published a paper on the economic benefits of independence, which was basically comparing the UK economy, because there's not sufficient data about the Scottish economy, but the UK economy and well-being in society with 6 other smaller nations, roughly the same size as Scotland.
Yeah.
And they happen to be all in Europe, and they've all had access to the single market. So they were basically saying, we could be like that, whereas if we stay within the UK, we're way down the league tables in a lot of the issues that were looked at.
Yeah.
And they were important issues. So where do you think we are now with, I mean, there's an assumption within that Scotland will be better off within the EU and within the single market, let's say, perhaps particularly than the EU necessarily. But what is the issues about access to that? Because there is an assumption that that would be a relatively easy process for Scotland to rejoin now that we've left.
Yes, that's a good point. Independence, right, just to try and work back from the number of layers of this. Independence is something that would be a transition. And there's a set of negotiations as well happen that lead us if we become independent. Now, in that, clearly, negotiations have happened all around the world about how places have become independent. There was 50 plus nations independent in 1945. There's 193 or 194 now. And Britain's been responsible for Britain used to be like a world expert in how other countries became independent. And actually statecraft, I mean, it's not a bad thing. It had a statecraft of imperial retreat. I mean things like the Good Friday Agreement, which is a brilliantly complex, nuanced set of arrangements of shared sovereignties of 2 nation states, is the sort of thing Britain used to be good at. And it's obviously, as we speak, is forgetting its own past. There's a kind of amnesia happening in the British state about what it did well. So the transition to independence will involve bumps, clearly, because you're setting up new structures. And there is, though, a whole worldwide literature on this. There's like 25 new nation states emerged from the end of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. So in that, Scotland starts with quite a lot of advantages, as in we are a modern, developed capitalist country. We don't even start in the way like, successes like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania did. But lots of those small European countries, referenced in the Scottish Government paper, are successes. There is no link between being small or big and being successful. Small adaptive economies can and work. And also, like as Tories are trying to reference, as I've mentioned in this debate several times, there's actually no relationship between levels of taxation and success. So, the 5 most successful countries in the world in terms of economic competitiveness and coherence and well-being are generally the Nordics, which have 5 of the highest levels of taxation. It's how you do these things, how you do tax, how you do public policy, how you align government, and kind of what your nation stands for. Now, I think in all that, and again, people would be very happy for people to disagree with me on this and here. I think where I comment on this is that there used to be a very powerful set of collective stories about Britain that people liked, that were about being fairer, being more equal, that were connected to the labour movement and trade unions, but not exclusively. Even the Tory party for a while bought into it. And I think those stories are really, really threadbare. And so I think there's a very, very much this kind of vacuum at the heart of what Britain is, that is one of, again, the drivers of this debate. And that if we became independent, this is a big challenge. Would we have the confidence to mobilise our own collective stories and shape our own future? Because, it doesn't happen by accident. You have to, as a society, be serious about that. And there's something missing in the UK that drives our debate. But it's a question, are we kind of confident enough, mature enough, prepared to get down to, the hard graft of what a better nation is, which, is the quote from Alistair Gray. As somebody tries to not do politics of faith, I do have a view on that, but I'm not sure, because it's a future question, really, basically. It asks a lot about us.
I think there was one of the contributors that raised the question, really, that in 2014 it was assumed by the Yes supporters that actually staying within Europe, within the single market at least, would be an easy process, that there was goodwill coming from Europe. But the suggestion now is that in the current context of the war in Ukraine, post-COVID, the swing to the right in the USA and so forth, that actually European states might be more concerned about the disruption that goes on from Scotland leaving the UK and not wanting to see more disruption. And I would also raise this would be a perfect vehicle for Mr. Putin to use his social media bots and so forth to disrupt. So
I agree.
The simple idea that Scotland would easily rejoin the single market was open to question as to whether that would be something which actually other European nations now simply would support, or would they be more a bit more standoffish about it?
I think there's so many levels what you've said. One on EU membership is clearly, EU membership again happens with a transitional set of processes. And you've just seen with Sweden and Finland coming into NATO, Turkey threatened a veto. There's long been, certainly in 2014, there was the spectre of the Spanish veto raised about Scottish independence. But you saw with Sweden and Finland, that would be, I think, finessed. What one has got, and again, these things are not 100% sure, but there is such dismay in Europe about how the UK has, the French under de Gaulle, as everyone knows, the French never wanted the UK in the EU, EEC as it was. And look, they've kind of been proven right. There's only several other small bits of the EU left it, like Greenland left it famously, and a set of French islands in the Caribbean that were part of the French state. There's never been a member state ever left. So you've got the EU issue that it does imply that Scotland has to have, fiscal factors and qualifications for membership and so on. But I think the bigger issue is the geopolitical issue. And to put it this way, Scottish independence not only matters at a UK level, it is a global and international issue. And that is partly because of the nuclear weapons, partly because of NATO membership, but also partly because of where Scotland sits. Scotland sits in this crucial point of the North Atlantic, and it's called the, I'm just trying to remember, the GIGB Gap, which means Greenland, Iceland, Great Britain Gap, which is the waters between Greenland, Iceland, and then UK. And those are the key waters to come from east into the North Atlantic. So they were crucial in World War II, sinking of the Bismarck and all that. And they were crucial in the Cold War, and they're becoming crucial again. So what this means is that US State Department, etc., Putin, they have traction in this game. And that means Scottish independence supporters and the SNP have to be very alive to this. And I do know from my information from people that whereas independence has got some thinking to do on several issues, this is where it's doing thinking. This is where the private discussions are happening between the British establishment and the SNP, because this is such a high-level game, basically. These are discussions that the British state would not consider in 2014 because Cameron gave an order. There'd be no scenario planning on a yes vote. And so, like Brexit, if yes had won, would have been staggering into the dark in terms of the British state. But this is where the thinking's going, because the stakes are just so high. And I think that's a good thing on all sorts of levels. And just to finish on this point, one of the areas it comes down to is that is a big issue is the nuclear weapons. Now, again, these are the nuclear weapons of the UK. They sit in Scottish waters. And so there's all sorts of kind of siren voices on both sides. There's friends I know who I think should know better on the independent side, who think if not they should sail away in week one, they should sail away in the first year. There'll be a negotiation. There'll be a set of transitional arrangements. They won't go anywhere soon. And in fact, if we go down this route, Scotland can ask for a certain price for the nuclear weapons remaining, because the nuclear weapons have to remain because of access to the North Atlantic and so on for a period. And thinking is going on this as we speak at this very minute. And it's something, the British state is taking more and more seriously, which I think it should.
But do you think there's enough public discussion of that geopolitical issues might be going on with the SNP insiders, but is it going on amongst our audience? Are they? No,
probably not. And you've probably got there, this is a subject for another discussion, you've probably got issues like, this is something I've researched a lot on, the state of what's called the public sphere in Scotland, which is the public life of Scotland, our broadcast media, our lack of think tanks, our lack of research agencies, our divorced nature of like large parts of our academia from serious public policy issues rather than like, you know, just reviewing strategy papers from, you know, the Scottish Government. So there's an issue here. As Scotland becomes, I think Scotland's already quasi-independent in how it sees itself, but that does not necessarily mean it becomes formally independent. There's a bigger challenge for all these agencies and media to lead more serious debate. Now, at the same time as that, print media has been hollowed out dramatically, as it has across the whole developed world. You know, the Herald, the Scotsman, these used to be great newspapers. They're thin things now. And so that's unfortunate. And social media, which has got many great things as well as many terrible things, is not an adequate substitute. So we have to, by the time of or when we have the next independence referendum, we have to have a bit more, research, serious public policy, more facts on the ground about what you're talking about, but actually about the big choices we face.
And I'm conscious that I'm asking questions, and I'm sure a lot of you are holding questions in your head or have got views on what we're talking about. But before we get to questions, one of the powerful bits of the book I found were the front and the back ends, which Gerry and Simon had written, particularly from Gerry's perspective, from looking at a professor of social change. So I thought it would be useful before we get to questions. We could go on with this discussion about individual issues. There's 30 chapters based on individual issues written by thinkers in those areas or academics sitting on the fence with them in a way. But I thought I'd quite like a chance really to give Gerry, as if he hasn't had enough free rein already,
I know exactly.
Free rein to set out his view about what the independence process should look like, perhaps, for the benefit of Scotland.
It's a good question. I was saying to somebody earlier, apologies if you're a Tory here in the audience, right? But I'm going to say something respectful. I don't hate anybody politically people I disagree with. I don't even hate Donald Trump. I really don't. I went to a Donald Trump rally and covered the 2016 presidential election that he won. He won the Electoral College, obviously. I think. I've become more and more like this as I've got older, of wanting to understand people I disagree with. So I've actually read hundreds of books on British Toryism for my sins. So I want to understand political opponents, and because I think that leads to a better debate. So here's two observations that might annoy half the audience each way. Right, one, there is a case for independence. There just is, right? And it's beyond that Scotland is a nation, why not argument, which is the argument some of my indie friends put. It's about a whole host of things. It's about the democratic argument, it's about Westminster collapsing, it's about, even more fundamentally, the stories Scotland tells itself, which I think are increasingly not about Britain. But there is a case for the union. Lots of my pro-indie friends say to me all the time, there's no case for the union, Gerry. And you think, God, why would you think that, The United Kingdom is the de facto status quo at the moment. We've been together 300 years. There's just lots of things unite us, There's all those good stories we had as Britain together. I increasingly think they're probably in the rear view mirror. But, it's possible they could be remade. And this is the point I get to. Somebody said to me earlier, just as I was coming in here, a friendly chap, as other author, he said, good luck with your nationalism, he said. And I said to him, I'm not a nationalist. I said, I'm a post-nationalist. And he looked at me all puzzled. I said, there's a whole worldwide school of something called post-nationalism. And funnily enough, the most post-nationalist institution in the world, which has its problems, is the EU. Because it's about shared sovereignties. It's about people saying, we might be a French nationalist and patriot, but we're going to pool. And I don't want a debate that is about Scottish nationalism versus British nationalism. Because unionism, again, this might annoy some people, unionism is a form of nationalism. Just as it's a thing about gluing together the United Kingdom. It's completely legitimate. And most nationalisms of most big nations, right, majority national, don't think of themselves nationalisms. Like America doesn't think it's got a nationalism, but it clearly does. But I think even though, there's the argument Scottish nationalism is benign, which it generally is, I want to try and explore a debate where we look at the values we are as a society, and are we social democrats? Are we centre left? And the Irish writer Fintan O'Toole said this marvellous thing to me in the 2014 vote. He said about Scottish nationalism, viewing it from an Irish perspective, and I think this is something when people that are pro-independence get this totally. He said, nationalism is the sort of thing like a rocket fuel that takes you in your rocket out into an orbit, but it then quickly burns up, and it doesn't leave you with the kind of like, the gyros or the kind of guidelines to then work out what kind of society you want to be. And he said, that is true of Ireland, that's true of everywhere in the world, and I think it will be true of Scotland. And I say that to my nationalist friends, etc. They say, yeah, that's broadly right. We need to get past this stage, then work out, where we want to be once we've done the rocket fuel. And in that, I want to be part of a debate where if the facts change, right, if you believe, say, in Scottish independence, if the United Kingdom were to work some of these big issues about, I would change my view. Or if Scottish independence couldn't address issues that are about, the inequality in the society, I would change my view on that. I'd like to be a part of a politics where at least some of us stick our head above the parapet sometimes and say, I don't want a debate that is about faith-based politics. I want to, it to be contingent on some of the facts, basically.
But the process we seem to be heading towards again is a sort of a very firm, well, the question I believe is going to be, should Scotland be an independent nation? The answer is yes or no. Which suggests a very sort of, not many shades of grey around that.
Yeah, of course.
And so that, and in a sense, that's the one parallel with Brexit is that it was that sort of question: are you in or are you out?
Exactly.
Very, very narrowly out, and then it's been that the no vote on Brexit has not really been reflected in the negotiations that went on. It was just merely dumped. And that doesn't seem to have been a very good process for the nation as a whole.
No, you're 100% right. And there will be a whole set of shades of grey in this debate as well. I mean, there's a way to be, one is, as the Tory party, as I keep referring to, embarks on yet another, after regicide, they elect another leader, is a Labour government gets more likely. Now, again, some people disagree with me on this, but a Keir Starmer Labour government, even one, probably would be a minority to begin with. And even though Scotland doesn't vote Labour, it's just it's a different set of dynamics on a whole host of levels. One being that, Scotland doesn't have that history, the same history of antagonisms towards Labour as it has had towards the Tories. It's also going to be true that a Keir Starmer government will have to, have some compromise with the SNP. There's a whole set of proposals coming out from Gordon Brown in something called a Constitutional Convention, which my last word on this was that it's going to be launched at Labour conference. Now, he's going to come up with this great big plan to democratise Britain, to decentralise and do all sorts of things, with, of course, the solution from Gordon Brown being that Gordon Brown has a solution, as is always the case. And what I understand about that is that, which I think is a big, big, big missed opportunity, is that that will, as it stands at the moment, not support proportional representation at Westminster, which would really aid Westminster having a different politics. But the point being that British politics may have an element of fluidity in them, and a Starmer government would aid some things that might have another aspect on this debate, and options in between independence and the union is just two choices.
So would you see a sort of a roadmap to independence as a potential way which is not so clearly yes, no, hard negotiations taking place, but more of a enabling negotiation where there's a roadmap which eventually leads to total independence?
Well, it's possible. It's possible. I mean, as the United Kingdom is, at the moment, with the degrees of, the fact that it doesn't work for so many people, we would end up, I think, eventually with another independence referendum. But that might be a more circuitous, less linear route than is currently imagined. I personally, this might annoy some people or cheer some people as well. I don't think there's much chance of an independence referendum next year. I'm not even sure I think it's a very good idea, because one is, I don't want to have been a polity where, there's no nation on earth become independent 52-48. I think the nearest one to that is Kosovo at 55-45. I think it's Kosovo or Montenegro perhaps. And like one place that voted, there's two places in the world voted for independence and decided not to do it. One was Western Australia and the other one was the Faroe Islands. The Faroe Islands voted in 1945 by 50.5% to 49.5% against independence. And then they decided not to do it because they just said, well, also the Danish government changed because, you know, Faroe Islands is a part of Denmark, and they got a maximum version of home rule. So I want to be in a situation where, I mean, I think we will end up in another independence referendum, but where it becomes more a confirmatory vote, because there's been 30 odd independence referendums around the world, apart from Scotland and Quebec. They nearly always are big emphatic votes for independence. So like famously when Norway votes for independence in 1905, there's only 148 people voted against it. Now that wasn't some Saddam Hussein plebiscite. That was a proper free vote where people already felt Norway's a nation, let's be independent of Sweden. Now we're never going to have a vote with 148 people against it. Not in this universe, you know. But I'd like it to be where we want it to be part of a consensus if we become independent or not, or we end this debate for a period if we don't become independent, and we work together as a society. You know, we say, right, that we accept that result, we mobilise ourselves to be for, you know, Scotland's future. And I think that's realistic. We don't, and this is where my Better Together friends say, this is a live issue. This will become eventually another independence referendum, because eventually this is a huge question. We have to settle it. You know, we can't keep on having never-endums. We can't keep on going with it being a question for the future that, you know, we don't know whether we'll be independent or not. So we at some point have to settle it, hopefully.
I think you referred to it earlier. I mean, I read the book as Scotland, the people of Scotland, not necessarily the politics of Scotland, the people of Scotland should be thinking about how Scotland becomes a better nation, and independence is one route to that. From a social change point of view, what would be the processes Scotland needs to undertake to work out what the future is that it wants, to be clearer about what that end of the...
That's worthy of a subject in itself, really, seriously. And I think one of the things that, I mean, somebody was asking me this yesterday, why I ended up writing so many books on Scotland and Scottish politics. And it was because when the Parliament came about, I was at a point where I was quite excited when Labour won in '97 because it was my first experience of a Labour government. So I was running a think tank, and I just started working on public policy and stuff like that. And then I had this road to Damascus conversion that I realised public policy isn't just what drives policy. What drives policy is the stories that institutions and people tell about what they want to do collectively. And that then maps into how people see future change and themselves as agents in that change. And so that got me thinking about futures literacy. And I did all sorts of interesting projects on this. I did a big Scottish project on this. And then, funnily enough, because the Scottish project worked so well, people in Glasgow said, let's do one in Glasgow, right? So I did this huge project on the future of Glasgow that people loved because they were talking about how you create the future stories of the city and how it maps to like how institutions do it. And I think that's what we need to look at. And this is what I mean when I say Scotland is already semi-independent. The story in my adult life, which is like the last 40 years, the stories people have told in Scotland has changed dramatically. As they do in all sorts of nations, and they continue to change, and they never reach an end point. And I put it to you in a couple of ways. Even the songs Scottish people and people in Scotland sing in public spaces have changed. If you take an arc, I was only thinking about this recently when I was reading a book written in the 70s that looked at this, the influence of the folk music movement in Scotland in the late 50s and early 60s. Within an arc of about 10, 15 years, Scottish people at football matches stopped singing God Save the Queen, practically universally, and started singing Flower of Scotland. And then it morphed into the rugby. Now, whether you like Flower of Scotland, I've increasingly grown to dislike it actually over the years. It's just something significant. The songs we sing in collective places tell us something about our stories. So this debate is about much, much more than public policy. It's about much, much more than even the democratic deficit or Westminster. It's who we see ourselves collectively and who we want to be, you know, the collective groups to decide our future. And in that sense, I think we are semi-independent, because there's been these huge set of shifts culturally, but it's whether we want to go the full hog, and that involves some of these questions being answered that we're talking about, detail, the nature of the UK, etc. You know, it's never a completely, it's never a story that completely reaches an end point, even if we become independent or a vote is lost in a subsequent referendum.
So it comes to me just to thank Gerry for his insights and his knowledge and spending time with us today. The Big Nation is on sale outside, at least 20 copies of it are on sale outside for $14.99. If you think it's run out, you can have a look at mine and take details of it. And there's a lot in this, a lot of detail, a lot of thought, more than we've been able to really fully express today. Thank you, Gerry, for your excellent...